I'm Rick O'Shea, the literary curator of the UCD Festival, and I'd like to welcome you to this, the second virtual edition of UCD Festival at Home for 2021. The UCD Festival is unique and award-winning, one where the global UCD community of students, alumni, future students, and also the wider general public join us for free online events. For the second year, we're not on campus, but instead where you are, bringing you all of the inspiring, engaging, and informative activities of the regular festival here for our digital and worldwide festival audience to enjoy. I'm particularly thrilled to be highlighting the series of UCD Festival at Home conversations. There are over 20 chats and discussions taking place, and with nearly 100 free, virtual, and engaging events also running across the weekend, there's something for everyone in the family to enjoy. You can stay up to date on the full UCD Festival at Home program at ucd.ie/festival. And don't forget, you can join the conversation through the chat function on YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag UCD Festival. Do get involved. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the event.
Welcome all to this 2021 UCD Festival at Home event. Tonight we are considering climate change, the impacts, policy and activism, a snapshot of current climate action challenges that we all face, both in Ireland and throughout the world over coming years. My name is Kevin O'Sullivan. I'm Environment and Science Editor with the Irish Times. As you'll notice, the term climate change doesn't appear in my job title, but the consequences of the climate and biodiversity emergencies increasingly dominate my work. We are delighted to have with us this evening Associate Professor of Urban Governance and Development, Niamh Moore-Cherry. She is based at UCD School of Geography. And Saoirse McHugh, an environmental campaigner of note from Achill Island, a former Euro-election candidate for the Green Party, who has a BSc in genetics, graduating from UCD in 2012. Unquestionably, the immediate threat to our climate and biodiversity is the biggest challenge we all face, amid signs that planet Earth is close to the abyss and nature is under intolerable stress. This is the backdrop to our discussion this evening, and we are focusing on how this is reflected through the work and lives of our two guest participants. And we hope that it's not too dominated by doomsday talk and that there is some degree of optimism and hope to share with you all. So firstly, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to introduce themselves and give a quick outline about how climate change affects their lives, affects their work, and then we'll go into further discussion. So over to you, Niamh, first.
Great, thanks very much, Kevin, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I suppose just to say that I am what we would call an urban geographer, so the focus of my research, and I live in a city. So I'm particularly interested in the effects of climate change and sustainability issues as they relate to cities in particular. And I think it's really important because very often cities get left behind in the climate debates. And they're critical producers of kind of the greenhouse gases that are, driving climate change and of the various dimensions. But they're also a really big part of the response. So if we can get our policies right in cities, we can really make a big contribution towards addressing climate change. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm really interested in what communities within cities can do at the local level. So sometimes we get a bit overwhelmed because we think it's just a big global crisis that we can do very little about. But actually, there's so much that we can do at the local level. And that's what interests me.
Great. Well, that's a good tee up for you. And Saoirse?
Well, first of all, as well, thanks, Kevin, and thanks to the UCD Festival for having me. I suppose I struggle to even imagine life without kind of being framed by the climate and biodiversity crisis. And I look with considerable envy upon people who clearly it doesn't, weigh on them every single day. Like it just looks like such bliss. So currently I have no job at the moment due to COVID, and it just never came back. But everything I do, I suppose, over the last few years has been attempts, sometimes a bit successful, sometimes not so successful, in trying to find out how I can live in ways that I can be at peace, I suppose, with my interaction with the climate crisis, but also, that I can in some way be a force for good in terms of our interactions with climate and biodiversity. I'm not a scientist myself, and so sometimes it can feel quite hard to find out, right, how can one person make a difference? And I don't actually know the answer, but in answer to your question is, it affects everything I do and the way I see everything.
So you both made reference to the weight of the whole challenge, which, once you delve more into it, it becomes really dominant in terms of people's thinking and concerns. And how do you balance that? I think that would be very helpful for people, because I think you can see the degree of climate anxiety that's out there, especially in young people, but through all generations. And some people just don't want to engage with the issue in the hope that it will go away. So how do you think people can sort of be involved, face up to the challenges, change their lifestyle, and yet not be overwhelmed? Niamh, would you like to come in first on that?
Wow, that's a really big question, Kevin. I suppose I'm going to answer this in a kind of a tangential way. So I have two kids. They're 11 and 9, and actually, what really upsets me is this sense of impending doom that they have, and the sense that things are terrible and your generation wrecked everything for us. And this is what I routinely hear from my 11-year-old. Why did you destroy the planet? And I'm like, I didn't do that. But we all did it a little bit. So how do we balance it up? I think, first of all, we can't be defeatist about it. So we have to think, look, if we have the capacity to I suppose, create a lot of the technologies, I suppose, that have actually done huge climate damage, then we equally have the capacity to develop the technologies and change our ways of living to actually try and mitigate the worst effects of what we've done and prevent it getting any worse. So I think that there has to be that sense that we have a power, because otherwise we'll just all sit back and go, we're never going to be able to do anything about this, so why should we bother? And I think that would be the worst thing ever. So I tend to be a pragmatist and an optimist, and I would say that what we have to be doing is, of course, putting the science out there. And I'm not a hard scientist either. Actually, I'm a social scientist. So, the science of it can often be very overwhelming. So I think what we all need to do is try and inform ourselves of, okay, the science is accepted now. So I think the idea generally of climate skepticism is gone. So that's one battle that has been won. We've now got a consensus that there is an emergency. So now we've identified the problem. Now is the time where we work on the solution. So I actually think we've made massive strides. So that's why I would be optimistic that we're moving into a better phase. If we take that approach, that as long as we have acknowledged there is a problem, then we're really creative beings. We can actually work on a solution.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And Saoirse, how do you view it?
Well, just picking up on something Niamh said there, like sometimes, I suppose, if you followed the doomy stuff to its logical conclusion, you would just give up. And I often found that, do you remember, it was based off some IPCC report which was saying, we have 12 years to have a good enough chance to stay below 1.5 degrees warming. And this became this, we have 12 years to save planet. And it kind of acted like, if we went over 1.5 or if we went over 2, that was it. We were just going to give up and go home. When I suppose there'll never be, no matter how warm it gets, to say, there'll never be a time to give up. Like, there'll always be something to fight for, and there'll always be some, I suppose with each increase in temperature, actually there'll be more of a reason to fight. But what I do personally is I'll get books on climate or biodiversity, and I will skip the first third, which usually just lists out all the negative things, and I will start going to the solution part of it. Because I was finding myself getting really down reading these things, and especially book after book or after report after news report, it can feel enormous. And I did happen on like a fantastic vein of books about rewilding, and the capacity of nature to recover I have found to be great solace over the last year or so. And I found it really dragged me out of quite a defeated place. And then in my life, from those books, I've started watching nature persevering in areas. And, you know, I'll take now great joy in like a single birch coming into leaf in Achill, where there were no birches before. And so it's just kind of narrowing in on these things that are surviving and can recover. Like there are basking sharks outside the window now, and they were gone for years because they were so overfished. And they're coming back now, and they're coming back more regularly and in higher numbers. And I find, if I can just narrow in and focus on things that do recover, it's quite encouraging.
Thank you for that. That really gives an uplift to us all. And great to see that magnificent species so close to your doorstep. But if for the next section, could I talk to you both about your own immediate environment? And Eve, you are obviously, your emphasis is on cities, and Saoirse is on the countryside and agriculture and marine life close by. So, Niamh, just could you explain why cities matter so much, and how? Okay, you say that there's a lack of recognition of their role, but in reality, they could have a huge influence in decarbonisation and containing temperature rise.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. And I think, look, the kind of simple answer to that is, I think it's 54% of the world's population lives in cities right now. By 2050, that's 70%. So that is a lot of carbon producers. And all of the things that happen in cities, that's a lot of carbon being produced as well. So just imagine that every one of those 70% of the world's population just did something small to reduce their carbon footprint. Maybe, they're not driving. Maybe they are, turning the temperature down in their house, small things. Imagine the cumulative impact of that on the planet. I mean, I think that's huge. There's massive potential. But from a more kind of strategic perspective, like cities are where we have dense groups of people together. So they're ideal for public transportation. Okay, so cities are the places where we can start to decarbonize in terms of removing cars, because we have enough of a dense population together to be able to put in, really good public transport infrastructure and actually use it. And I think I saw the most kind of heartening thing yesterday. One of our master's students is doing some work on cycling in Dublin, and mapped out using the census the commuting patterns of people. And pretty much within the canal of the Royal and the Grand Canal, the dominant mode of transport was either cycling or walking. And I think that's fantastic in terms of commuting. So that's one reason why cities can be really, really powerful. But I think also, we sometimes forget that, cities are also kind of originally natural environments and can be as Saoirse was saying, rewilded. I think one of the most interesting places I've ever been is in the Ruhr Valley, which we all associate with, industrialization, coal mining, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. And they had just, deindustrialized, and they had just left the big industrial structures there, and there were trees growing out of them. So they turned it into a landscape park, this old industrial place in the middle of the Ruhr Valley. And to me, that was really inspiring, because it really means that nature will always try and win out. And I think if we just let a little bit of that into our cities, that would be really important. So there's lots happening, in terms of green infrastructure, trying to, re-green our cities. But I think what that requires is really strong political will to think about our development models and what we prioritize when we develop within cities. And it also we can, new technologies in terms of building. So we can, try and move towards, carbon neutral developments. And there's actually a proposal for the part of the Connolly Quarter at the back of Connolly Station, down right in the heart of Dublin city centre, for a carbon neutral quarter. So I think, again, it's back to this idea of innovation and our creativity and our technology, and having a critical mass of people together that can actually help to decarbonise. So I think what we're looking at in cities is a range of options to think about how we do cities differently that then complements what happens in other areas in terms of other sectors and industries and so on and other types of places.
Well, that's really heartening in terms of what can be achieved on your doorstep. In terms of the countryside then, Saoirse, how do you view it? And I suspect there's a particular problem in terms of the future course of Irish agriculture within that context, but also on a more positive note, the restoration of our landscape and particularly our peatlands could have a huge impact.
Yeah, definitely. And as Niamh touched on as well, lots of this is to do with reimagination. I don't think it would, it's never just going to be a technical fix. I don't think it will also involve a revisioning of things. And so where I am specifically in Achill, it's all sheep, and there's big commonages, like really spectacular cliffs and mountains, a beautiful place, but it is extremely barren. Like everything is just eaten down, right down. And this, of course, is incentivized by the Common Agricultural Policy. And we have had, it's become chicken and egg now with the Common Agricultural Policy, in that it has incentivized a certain type of agriculture that now reinforces itself and campaigns for more of itself all the time. So we have this kind of rolling entrenchment, I think, of Irish agriculture in, and when you think about access to land and access to green spaces, it's often, thought about as purely a city thing. But if you drive around rural Ireland, there are people walking on the roads in high vis, like walking along the road, miles of empty, barren fields, but they are on a road wedged in beside a hedgerow with trucks barreling past. And so I do think, access to land and access to nature is an issue in rural Ireland as well. And there could be enormous changes even within our national parks. I was zooming in last night on Wicklow National Park, and you zoom right in, and this big area is barren, but even on the picture, there's a big fire going at the time. You can just see the smoke going up across the Google Maps picture. And I just thought, imagine coming from the States or other countries. And we all go to areas like that. I used to work in Alaska for years. And almost all of Alaska's tourism is based on, big nature, big, clean, expansive nature. And it has a massive tourist industry. So oftentimes you'll hear, this idea that the natural world is somehow kind of incompatible with rural economy or rural enterprise, which is has never been proven anywhere. Au contraire, around the world, the very opposite is the fact. And I think, with Irish agriculture, and it's not so relevant in Achill or Mayo, there's been this expansion of the dairy herd that has been pushed, and has been continued to be pushed till 2027. I think we're supposed to have another 12% increase of the dairy herd by 2027. And it does just feel like our government that is, making these policies and signing off on this trajectory are saying, on one hand, yes, we agree to the Paris goals, we have our own climate plan, and completely denying it with their actions, which in the end are the important thing. They won't say anymore, I don't the importance of climate action or action on biodiversity, but they will still act like they don't believe it. And I think, land hoarding, property hoarding, there's so many issues in Ireland, in rural Ireland, alongside kind of agriculture, alongside the use of our peatlands, that really, with a bit of imagination and some kind of, and a lot of genuine engagement between different people, could have I get really excited thinking about it, but really beneficial results across every sector of rural Ireland. And the issue at the moment, and we were talking briefly about this before we came on, is that the whole debate about rural Ireland and land use in rural Ireland and agriculture in rural Ireland and peatlands in rural Ireland has become so detached from reality. Like it's really more like these American culture wars that they have around things, that I believe, no, it's not that I believe, that many politicians I know are using a lot of fears, genuine fears, as ways to pump up their own electoral success. And it's a disservice to all of us who use the land, all of us in rural Ireland, and their own constituents, that they are pumping up their fears. So I am optimistic about it, because I think there's such small changes like land use, well, like who gets to use land or what it's used for, that can have such enormous changes like throughout society and economies. So yeah, it sometimes it feels really far away, but I also think sometimes it feels really close.
But I think there's a distinctive brand of polarization in Ireland. How do you think we'll overcome that? Because it means that progress is difficult to achieve when you don't even have consensus on land use.
Yeah, I think you're right, Kevin. But I think there's like new ways to engage, and that's what I think we need. And I'm really struck by Saoirse's use of the word sort of revisioning, reimagining. And that goes for everything. And that goes for how we do planning, how we do politics, all of that. So, we talk about communication and engagement and participation, but what does that mean? And actually, people aren't stupid. If it's not done properly, they can see it for what it is. And very often it's just tokenistic, ticking a box. But I really think, that if we harness ideas of people living in areas, and this is something that I'm really quite interested in from my own research perspective, in terms of, we need place-based approaches. So we need to actually be working with communities. And this is something we've tried to do in the School of Geography. We've been working on a project called Mapping Green Dublin. And we invested a year in consulting with the community about what they saw as the strengths and deficits and opportunities of their areas, and then trying to take it from there. And I think that kind of approach is probably what we need on a bigger scale. But it requires new skills, it requires new mindsets, and it requires this sense that it's not like a win-lose situation. Just because a decision is made doesn't mean somebody loses out, that actually we should be trying to look for the win-wins quite a lot of the time. So one of the things, just kind of coming back to something Saoirse was saying, there's big debates in the Northwest region, I think, around, reforestation. And, there's lots of tensions because farmers are worried about land values if, there's more forests put in and so on. But, there has to be a way of managing that dynamic so that it actually becomes a win-win for both, for the environment and for farmers. And they're concerned about their livelihoods, and that's completely understandable. But I think we need to be looking more for those win-win scenarios and a little bit less into the, well, if that happens, then I'm going to lose out. So that's something I think that is really, really important to bear in mind. And the other thing, and I'm sure Saoirse will talk to this, is this idea of, we have to make this transition, but it has to be just. So it has to be, inclusive. Certain people cannot be the losers here for others to win out.
Yeah. And I think we're at a very early stage on the just transition bit. Is that fair to say, Saoirse?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, even with that, as I would imagine, a just transition isn't a single action. It's not a single committee. This is well, it is those things, but it's also a process communities have to go through.
Yeah.
So just transitions are several decades long, and I feel that we as a country were, well, not caught on the hop, but we refused to plan. And so we're behind in certain areas in terms of implementing a just transition or facilitating a just transition. But on that, I think, to avoid that polarization, I think what has to happen is, especially in political communication, the emphasis is not on what you can't do, but the emphasis is on how it will improve somebody's life. So I've found like the turf cutting thing. And now, of course, before I go on, it is in certain politicians' interest to make it about what you can't do. But the way to combat that is not to say, no, you'll still be allowed to cut turf, or we're only talking about, large scale peat extraction, because that's intentionally being conflated with domestic turf cutting. But the policy that should be communicated and pushed on is that everybody's home reaches a certain level of efficiency and warmth. And if after all of that, people are still cutting turf, then perhaps look at introducing a ban on domestic turf cutting. But up until then, you would be, preparing for that policy to fail. And I do think this is a problem across all environmental policies. Is it can be sometimes forgotten that policies have a social life that often has a larger effect on whether they succeed or fail than their actual merits of the policy itself. And it sometimes it's maybe, I don't know why it's so completely ignored so often. And I think maybe it is because environmentalists are like, well, look, of course this is good. We all want emissions to be reduced by X, or this species being, their habitat to be restored by X amount. But in reality, like, everyone in one way or the other thinks about themselves first and how it will affect their lives. And I think that's maybe a part of a battle that the environmental movement in Ireland has been falling behind on for years. Really telling the story, telling the story to SNAs, telling the story through teachers, telling the story through nurses and builders and hairdressers, and just through everything. Because, and this is, like, I suppose, maybe makes it harder to think about, but climate action is not a separate set of policies. And I don't even think it should have a separate department. I think there should be like a secretary for climate action in every single department. But climate action is, will be acted upon. It's housing policy, it's health, it's everything. And separating it out as such makes it more difficult for people to, I believe, to get behind. I don't know if I even answered your question. I think I went on rambling there.
No, I see where you're coming from. But just in terms of political action, then, the new climate ambition that's there since 2019, the Greens are now in government, and I know you've had you had a connection to the Greens that's no longer there at the moment. But how do you view that? Like, they're saying, "Oh, we are going across government in all our action." Do you think that they're coming up short on that, or there's not enough pace in coordination, or how do you view it?
I think that it has not been taken seriously. Just a few days ago, 6 Fine Gael TDs came out trying to, and I believe the Taoiseach just came out today again saying that An Taisce should consider withdrawing their appeal on an objection to a new Glanbia and Royal Aware cheese plant down, I think, Kilkenny, Wexford area. And they are doing that while also saying, oh, well, we're totally behind this climate bill. So, of course, I feel that this is not being taken seriously. It definitely feels like, if certain parties are saying, oh, yeah, we're in government with the Greens. This means that we agree with them, but are acting against that. Like, there were Fine Gael ministers calling for An Taisce to be defunded over this. Like, that's that's threatening people's jobs. And that's, once again, pumping up this, playing on the fears, not having a rational discussion as to why is An Taisce appealing this? Why are farmers dependent on this factory opening? And the reason they are is because of government policy. They've been told to expand. Now they've nowhere to sell their milk. Why, if they were serious, those same Fine Gael TDs would be talking about a debt relief program and a managed scale down for dairy farmers. So I just, when things like that happen, when the Taoiseach is calling on An Taisce to withdraw its appeal, it doesn't feel like the coalition is working as a unit. And in the interest of climate action.
Okay. So Niamh, what's your sort of wearing your urban hat? Do you think there is the required momentum within the cityscapes to really embrace decarbonisation, to really have a transformative change in urban societies?
Not yet. I mean, I think some of the concerns that Saoirse has raised in the rural sphere are exactly the same in the kind of city sphere. So there's actually very little incentive for elected politicians to actually grasp this agenda, because very often it will involve very immediately unpalatable decisions. And of course, they want to get re-elected. So that's going to be their priority, I suppose, in terms of that. But I think the issue that Saoirse picks up really well is this idea of the separate climate action piece. So we have, separate climate action plans at city levels. But, actually what should happen is the climate action should run right through city development plans. It should run right through local area plans. So it should be mainstreamed. And again, I think going back to what Saoirse was saying, if it was mainstreamed across every government department, like she suggests, rather than just having its own, that would mean that there has to be collective responsibility for it. And everybody has to take responsibility. And I think that's really important, because I think as long as you can kind of scapegoat one person or one policy as failing, that's easy. But actually, if it's mainstreamed across everything, it makes it much more difficult. And at this sort of city level, I think it comes back to the same issues as in the countryside. It's about land, it's about property, it's about private property ownership and an unwillingness to interfere with that in an Irish context. And until you put in incentives for builders, and I don't mean tax incentives, but almost disincentives to do it wrong, you're not going to make that much change. So, and I kind of think our planning system has a long way to go to become kind of climate supportive. So we see lots of very large scale developments going up in cities. They're even bypassing the local development plans to do this and going straight to on board Planola for these massive scale developments. And they're arguing that this is for sustainable urban development. And, that's questionable. Other people would argue that that's about maximizing the value of a particular site and returns on it. So I think until those large developers in urban contexts and in cities generally actually have to have some sort of community gain, which might be about funding a new public transport piece of infrastructure or something as part of these developments, unless we start thinking in that integrated way, I think we're going to miss the potential for what can actually happen at the urban level. But that requires massive disruption to how things are done as it is.
Okay, and what cities should we be really looking up to as exemplars in that regard?
Oh, I hate those kinds of questions, Kevin, because I always think, it comes back to my thing that, everything is kind of context specific. And, people, always talk about Copenhagen as being a great example, or, look at Amsterdam and look at all the cycling that goes on there. Look, I think we can do it the Irish way. And I think we just need to be a bit imaginative about what that looks like in an Irish cultural context, in an Irish weather context, and come up with our own solution. I really think we can learn from what other places are doing and how they're doing things. But really, we're creative people. We're educated people. We're one of the most creative people on the, nations on the planet. We have to be able to do this ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. But listen, how about climate adaptation? Like, cities are particularly vulnerable. Like all major Irish cities are on coastlines. We have to take greater consideration of all of that. And is that doable in parallel?
Yeah, I think it is. You're right. All our cities are on the coasts for historic reasons. And we do need to be careful. So we do need to be thinking about sea level change. We do need to be, thinking about when we're developing now in our cities, how are we going to do this? So Cork is a great example, actually. Cork is really vulnerable from tidal flooding, river flooding, from underground flooding as well. So, they're really trying to come up with innovative solutions there in terms of, unlocking the potential of the Docklands area in Cork in the context of potential sea level rise. So I think that's the way we need to be thinking. It's not about stopping development, but it's about adaptation. How can we do things differently? how can we live with the environment? I'm kind of thinking about the living with COVID thing, but it's like, how can we live with this environmental change, and how can we try and ensure, that we let nature take its course? Maybe we allow particular places to flood. That might be a deliberate strategy, and we do our developments around those kinds of things. So again, it comes back to reimagining, what is possible.
Right. Well, that's definitely good guidance. So just before we close, I'd just like to ask you about the mood music internationally. Obviously, with the ousting of Trump, to put it that way, things have changed a lot on the international stage. And, how do you view COP26 in Glasgow in November? Do you think it's going to be the really clinch event to try and put Paris Agreement on the right track to really act collectively on a global scale? And you can see the way the agenda has been firmed up, which is very heartening. The Biden summit was obviously very interesting, and there was a lot of tangible commitment there on net zero, on halving emissions by 2030. But are you taken in by all that? Does it sort of reassure you? Maybe Saoirse, you come in first on that.
Well, I've actually been incredibly positively surprised by Biden. I have a vote in the US, and did vote for Biden, but with no real enthusiasm. I felt quite like, oh God, Biden, right, fine, I suppose. But I have been, consistently surprised by him. The Biden summit, as you said, I was like, okay, wow. Because even the very first maybe signals from the Biden administration, they had John Kerry was put as a climate advisor, I think, on the national security roundtable, whatever they called it over there. And I thought, oh Christ, this will be this will be just a militarized approach. There won't be anything but a kind of a militarized idea of climate adaptation. But yeah, he's even up till a few days ago when the Biden administration supported the TRIPS waiver, I've just been consistently surprised. So I am more optimistic about COP26. Now, I suppose a lot of those, high level world targets and stuff I found myself always disappointed and always let down, and they're just so fudgeable. There's no real accountability. And so I don't think it will change the world particularly. But hopefully, every little movement towards countries taking this seriously is a good thing.
Okay. And how about you, Niamh? Are you heartened by the way things are going?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would agree with Saoirse. I actually, of course, if I'd had a vote in the US, I would have voted the same way Saoirse did, probably with the same feelings. But there's something in quiet little radicalness. I think that Biden is showing that you can do things quietly, but quite radical things, and I think he's doing that in other domains, and I suspect that will probably spill out. So I think that's really important. The mood music has definitely changed. But I also think COVID has changed things. And for all the awfulness of what's happened over the last year and a half, it's actually really made people appreciate, I think, what they have and their environment, particularly during the lockdowns, where the environment closest into you became really, really important. And I actually think that has helped reconnect people. And I actually think that can be harnessed, certainly for the future, in terms of people respecting and actually really beginning to value what it is that they have around them and wanting to maintain it or make it better.
Absolutely. And my final question to you both is, and I think this is a really key thing, and Frans Timmermans made reference to it recently, that we are the generation really that have to make the sacrifices and act decisively for the next generations, your children, my children, your own families. Do you believe that is the case, that we really now must take some considerable pain in decarbonising, particularly in the initial decade?
I don't believe so. I think that's only the case if your idea of pain is a reduction in consumption, which I don't think has to be the case at all. I think we can vastly improve things, actually. We can reduce working weeks. We can improve our environment. We can, increase quality time with our families. So no, I don't agree with that at all.
Fair enough. And you, Niamh?
Yeah, again, I think I would be a little bit like Saoirse on this one as well. And going back to COVID, I think the fact that we all have been consuming a lot less has actually made us rethink how we live, and that's a good thing.
Right. Fair enough. Well, listen, it's been really interesting, and thank you for your participation. And if I could say, both of you have very distinct presences on the Irish climate map, which we all benefit from. And you're working in areas that are really important to the well-being of Irish society and the Irish environment for coming decades. So on behalf of all the participants or all the viewers tonight, may I thank you very much and wish you well in your efforts, and hopefully that social public engagement side of things will grow in momentum as it needs to do in coming years. So I think you've touched on that issue really well and underlined its importance. So I'm very grateful. So I'd like to also thank UCD and the Festival Committee for organising this event. And I hope as viewers you found it enlightening and helpful. And as you know, there are other events under the UCD Festival at Home to be dipped into, and I recommend that you do. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and I wish you well. Bye-bye.